Greetings, everyone. This is Katie Brown with Education Leads Home and Schoolhouse Connection. We are getting ready to start our webinar for today, but I wanted to let everyone know that hopefully by now you can see the screen, and we'll have all of our panelists joining us via audio in about 4 minutes. So we'll go ahead and launch the webinar in 4 minutes. Thanks so much. Greetings, everybody, and welcome to our first Education Leads Home webinar of 2019, Be Attentive to Attendance, Leveraging Chronic Absenteeism Data to Help Students Experiencing Homelessness. A little bit of housekeeping. At the end, we are going to field questions, but if you have questions in the meantime, this webinar is obviously for you, and we want you to ask those questions. Please enter them in the questions pane to the right Later on in the webinar, in one of the slides, I mentioned the chat box, and I miswrote that. Really, just go ahead and enter them in the pane labeled questions. You should see a tiny triangle that you can click on to open that up, and then click send, and we should be able to see them, and then we'll field questions near the end of the webinar. This webinar and all materials associated with it are going to be posted at this hyperlink. If for some reason it doesn't work, you should receive an email at the conclusion of the webinar, and you'll be redirected to our website where we post all of our archived webinars and associated materials. Included in that is going to be a chart or spreadsheet that notes all of the questions asked and all of the responding answers. A little bit about Education Leads Home. We're a national campaign dedicated to overcoming homelessness for children and youth. And we have 3 high-level goals focused on participation and attainment pertaining to early childhood programs, high school graduation rate, and post-secondary participation. You can read more about our campaign at our website, which is still evolving, so apologies for its one-dimensional nature right now, but we're going to be growing it within the next month at educationleadshome.org. And we welcome your questions and comments either through the website or you can direct them to me. A little bit about Education Leads Home's core partners. Again, we're a national campaign comprised of 4 national partner organizations, all dedicated to policy and practice serving children and youth experiencing homelessness. And you can read about the Institute for Children, Poverty, and Homelessness, Schoolhouse Connection, Civic, and America's Promise Alliance at our respective websites. And several members of our respective organizations are participants in this call. And again, we're always happy to field questions and serve as a resource for all of you. Our presenters today will go ahead and each introduce themselves. So go ahead and take it away, Jennifer.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Erb Downward. I'm a Senior Research Associate at Poverty Solutions at the University of Michigan.
I'm Rachel Barth. I'm a Senior Policy Analyst at the Institute for Children, Poverty, and Homelessness.
I'm Tori Boland. I am a homeless liaison for Washoe County School District for our program called Children in Transition.
And I'm Brittany Kucera. I'm the program coordinator for Children in Transition with the Washoe County School District.
And again, everybody, this is Katie Brown. I'm the program manager for the Education Leads Home campaign with Schoolhouse Connection. So today's agenda, we're going to start with an overview of chronic absenteeism and its effects on students. We'll segue into some national chronic absenteeism data. Then we'll share some case studies from Michigan and New York City. We'll dive into some best practices and lessons learned from Washoe County, and then we'll share a little bit about policy implications. At the end, we should have about 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A. So please, again, go ahead and send your questions in the questions pane, and we'll field those at the very end. All right, go ahead and take it away, Jennifer.
All right, thanks so much, Katie. So before we talk more about the impact that homelessness has on student attendance, we all thought it would be a good idea to just talk a little bit about what chronic absenteeism is and what the research shows about why this is really a critical measure to be considering for student success. So chronic absenteeism is when a student misses 10% or more of days enrolled in the school year. And this is generally considered in most states to be both if they miss more than half of the day. So 10% of all school days, and they'd have to be in attendance for at least half of that day. And this includes both excused and unexcused absences. So the reason that this has become a widely accepted really important educational indicator of student success is because there's extensive research about the impact that being chronically absent has on students. So students who are chronically absent have been found to be less likely to meet grade level proficiency standards. They are more likely to drop out of school, and the evidence suggests that these impacts really start in the early grades and last over time. So one study looked at third grade students and those who were chronically absent in both kindergarten and first grade. And what they found was that if you looked at students who were not chronically absent in either of those grades, about 64% were reading at grade level in third grade. For the students who were chronically absent during those 2 early years, only 17% of them were reading at grade level in third grade. So there's a lot of evidence to suggest that chronic absenteeism has both immediate and long-lasting impacts, and that the impacts really start early. So it's something that we need to think about. Another reason why chronic absenteeism is really an important indicator is that attendance is often a warning sign for other issues that might be impacting a student. So when a student is consistently missing school, there are often many other challenges, and homelessness is one of those that missing school frequently often reveals. Next slide. So nationally, there is some comparative data that goes back to 2015-16, and this looked at chronic absenteeism rates from across all 50 states. And what they found was that, oops, sorry for the, there's a slight change in the webinar page here, was that there were almost 8 million students who were chronically absent from school in 2015-16. So this was one of the studies nationally that really launched chronic absenteeism as an issue that more and more states are taking into consideration now. So now there are 36 states plus the District of Columbia that have submitted chronic absenteeism as a part of their ESSA state plans. And this is something to think about as you're going through this webinar and thinking about how the information here can be relevant to you. If your state is one of those states that has included chronic absenteeism as an indicator or a measure to be improved in their ESSA plan, that can be a really helpful point to keep in mind in terms of raising the relationship between chronic absenteeism and homelessness among students. So one thing that is possible to do with the education data is to create basically more awareness about the impact of homelessness on attendance. So what we did in Michigan, and this can be useful for states maybe who do not have access to linked data yet between the chronic absenteeism data and their graduation data. One thing that you can do is to just show the differences across groups about who is being impacted most by chronic absenteeism in your state. So we looked at this in Michigan, and as you can see on the chart to the right, what we see is that homeless students were by far and above the most impacted by chronic absenteeism at school. So homeless students and low-income students account for about 50% of all students in Michigan schools, but they accounted for 75% of all students who are chronically absent. And when you look at the relationship across different groups, what you can see is that homeless students were chronically absent at a rate that was over 2.5 times the rate of their housed peers and over 4 times the rate of their higher income peers. So the reason that this can be very helpful information in terms of trying to advocate more for why schools and school districts need to pay attention to the needs of homeless students is because if you look at this average bar across the top, on average in Michigan, about 16% of homeless students were chronically, or about 16% of all students were chronically absent in the state of Michigan. And what you can see is that homeless students are actually pulling up that average. Only 15% of housed students were chronically absent and just 8% of higher income students. So really, if the state has set in its ESSA plan that they want to see a reduction in chronic absenteeism, they need to be working to address the needs of homeless students. They need to be working to address the needs of low-income students and really tailoring some of those plans. And so this is the kind of information that you can present to superintendents, to school principals, to try to help them understand why it is in not just the students' best interest, but in their best interest in terms of meeting these larger goals to really think about and meet the needs of homeless students. And just one thing that I realized I forgot to mention, but when we talk about homeless students here, we're using the educational definition of homelessness. So that's defined under the McKinney-Vento Act as children and youth who lack a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence. So this is, of course, different than the HUD definition. And if anyone has questions about that, we can talk a little bit more about that at the end. Okay, next slide, Katie. Another thing that we did in Michigan that was very helpful in terms of starting the conversation around chronic absenteeism and the relationship between homelessness and chronic absenteeism was to really look at the data at a very local level. One thing that you can see on the left here is there's a map of all the school districts in the state. And you can see that while chronic absenteeism, about 40% of students in Michigan who are homeless were chronically absent, there was a really wide range by school district. And this ranged from 13% of students, which is lower than the statewide average, to 86.5% of students. So that can be really helpful information for people to think about, because this means that there are opportunities for improvement. There are school districts where things are going better and we need to find out what is being done that's working. And there are also school districts where students are really, really struggling and we need to figure out why. And bringing this information down to that local school district level not only can help to demonstrate that point, but also can make it so that the information is there for local communities to really put pressure on their school district to answer some of these questions as to why these differences exist. So we've had a lot of success in terms of partnering with media, presenting this data to McKinney-Vento coordinators, school districts, to really talk about what is going on and what opportunities exist, how things are different in different areas, and people have been very receptive. Another thing that looking at the local data really enables you to do is you can look at the school district level and think about what is the difference between what school districts are struggling with chronic absenteeism overall and what school districts are really only struggling with chronic absenteeism for homeless students. And the reason that this can be so helpful is because some school districts, when we looked at this, some school districts that had really fairly normal rates of chronic absenteeism for the state overall had incredibly high rates for homeless students. And that, in some cases, those rates were high in both instances. But you can showing this kind of data makes it possible to really bring home the point that it's not enough to just look at chronic absenteeism rates for students as a whole. We really need to break apart these different groups, see what's happening, and to develop interventions that are going to support students who are struggling in different ways. So this kind of local data and local mapping can really help to show those differences. And before I pass this presentation off to Rachel, I guess the last thing that I will say is that Rachel is going to show a lot of excellent data that links chronic absenteeism and graduation rates. And if you have that information, that is fabulous. But if you don't, even without that kind of linked data, you can make a strong case for meeting the needs of homeless students and meeting attendance support needs, because so many states have recognized attendance and chronic absenteeism as one of their larger ESSA goals. So don't be discouraged, and there are a lot of different ways that you can just use some very basic information that is publicly available. All right, I'm going to pass it on to you, Rachel.
Thanks, Jen. So now we're going to talk about New York City and how chronic absenteeism affects graduation rates. Our data is from the New York City Department of Education, and we work really closely with them. And we also have several years of data, which allows us to look at outcomes over time, which is really helpful in a situation like this. And just to note, New York City's right to shelter policy is unique. So the city's homeless students are more likely to live in shelter than in other cities and states, but the outcomes of both homeless students living in shelter and living in other temporary arrangements should be similar regardless of geography. And so even as graduation rates in New York City rise, homeless students continue to graduate at lower rates than house students. And homeless students were also more likely to experience what we're calling instability factors. So that includes chronic absenteeism as well as mid-year transfers. So they're more likely to experience those than house students. But students that did not transfer mid-year or experience chronic absenteeism, so they didn't experience any of those instability factors, those students graduated at rates really similar to their housed peers. Next slide. So to get into the report, we're going to start by going over who these students are. These were New York City public high school students who started high school in 2013 and graduated on time in 2017. And to talk a little bit about how we broke up the students. So never homeless students were students who lived in stable housing for all 4 years of high school. Students who were ever homeless experienced homelessness at some point during 4 years of high school. And then among those students who were never in shelter experienced homelessness at some point during high school, but never lived in a shelter and instead lived doubled up with friends or family in other temporary arrangements or somewhere not meant for human habitation. And then students who were ever in shelter were students who experienced homelessness at some point during high school and lived in a city-funded or operated facility, including Tier 2 shelters, hotels, and cluster sites. So nearly 1 in 10 graduates of New York City public schools in 2017 had experienced homelessness at some point during high school. In those 4 years between 2013 and 2017. And of those students, about 1/3 lived in a shelter at some point during high school, and the remaining 2/3 lived doubled up or in other temporary arrangements and had never been in a shelter during high school. Next slide. So how do graduation rates compare between housing settings? Citywide, 74% of all students and 77% of house students graduated on time, compared to just 56% of homeless students. And among homeless students, 63% who had never stayed in a shelter graduated on time, while less than half, just 45% of students who lived in a shelter at some point during high school graduated on time, which was well below their housed and even below their never in shelter peers. But students, so as you can see, students who ever lived in shelter were by far the group least likely to graduate, but it's not just because they live in shelter. Next slide. So we'll get back to graduation rates in a moment, but right now we're going to talk about the prevalence of those instability factors I mentioned, both mid-year transfers and especially chronic absenteeism. So homeless students were much more likely to experience instability factors like mid-year transfers and chronic absenteeism. And this chart, I know there's a lot going on, shows what percentage of each housing group experienced mid-year transfers, chronic absenteeism, neither or both. So the top group is they didn't experience any instability factors. The next one is they experienced mid-year transfers. Then they were chronically absent. And then the blue bubbles meant they experienced both mid-year transfers and chronic absenteeism. And that's during at least 1 year of high school. And these categories are not mutually exclusive. So students that experienced both transfers and chronic absenteeism are included in the individual group, as well as in the group that shows both, that bottom line of bubbles. So as you can see, homeless students, especially those in shelter, were much more likely to experience instability factors. Less than half, just 46% of house students were chronically absent during at least 1 year of high school, compared to just over half, 55% of never in shelter homeless students, but 81% of students who were ever in shelter were chronically absent, which means that less than 20% or 2 in 10 sheltered students were not chronically absent during high school, during at least 1 year of high school. Of those students that experienced both instability factors, that was 32% of all homeless students and 44% of homeless students who were ever in shelter transferred mid-year and were chronically absent. And that's compared to just 14% of house students. So as you can see, all homeless students, but especially those in shelter, were much more likely to experience these instability factors. Next slide. So this chart is similar to the last one, but this shows just housed and homeless students, and the categories here are mutually exclusive. So the students are only counted in one category. So students who transferred and were only transferred and were only chronically absent are counted in those groups, and the students that both transferred and were absent are only counted in that group, so that blue bar at the end. And while homeless and housed students were equally likely to experience only chronic absenteeism, and homeless students were only slightly more likely to experience only mid-year transfers, homeless students were more than twice as likely to be both chronically absent and experience mid-year transfers. Only half of housed students experienced any instability factor, while 71% of homeless students experienced at least one instability factor. And as you can see, transfers on their own were much less common. So for the most part, students that experienced some combination of instability factors experienced chronic absenteeism. And as I said, that was disproportionately homeless students. Next slide. And so now to get back to graduation rates, the presence of any instability factors negatively affected graduation rates among all students, but homeless students were, again, disproportionately affected by instability factors, leading to much lower graduation rates overall. If you remember the first graduation rate chart. So homeless students with no instability factors graduated well above the overall citywide and housed graduation rates at 90% compared to 96% of housed students that didn't experience any instability factors. And at the beginning, Katie mentioned the goal of a 90% graduation rate by 2030. And based on this data, that might be achievable if chronic absenteeism is addressed among homeless students. Chronic absenteeism was much more strongly associated with lower graduation rates for homeless students than for their housed peers. So while chronic absenteeism was associated with lower graduation rates among both housed and homeless students, chronically absent homeless students graduated at a rate slightly below the overall graduation rate for homeless students, which was that was 54% compared to 68% of housed chronically absent students. So while chronic absenteeism did affect both housed and homeless students, it had a much bigger effect on homeless students. And you can see the gap between the groups is the biggest in the chronically absent group. And graduation rates were the lowest among students that experienced both instability factors. So the last bar, you can see less than a quarter, just 24% of homeless students that experienced both mid-year transfers and chronic absenteeism graduated on time. And it's important to note how many students fell into each of these groups, as we saw in the previous charts, and as you can see in the N sizes here, the majority of homeless students were either chronically absent or were both absent and transferred. And homeless students who were not chronically absent graduated above the citywide rate and nearly at the overall housed rate. And then the absence of any instability factors meant that homeless students graduated at extremely high rates. So it's, again, important to note not only that chronic absenteeism can have a huge negative effect on graduation rate, but that homelessness alone has a smaller impact on graduation rates, and mitigating chronic absenteeism can be an enormous benefit to homeless students. Tori and Brittany, take it away.
All right, so we're going to talk about how we use data within Washoe County School District on chronic absenteeism to improve the outcomes for the students in our program, Children in Transition, which is our McKinney-Vento program. Next slide, please. What we'll be discussing today is poverty and unaffordable housing data within Nevada and Washoe County, our program specifically, and what we do, chronic absenteeism, and applying the data to track chronically absent CIT students, the data warehouse that our Department of Accountability uses, real-time tracking among our children in transition population, and the tracking services and how they may influence student outcomes. Next slide, please.
So we wanted to take a look at a picture of homelessness in Nevada first. Nevada is ranked 44th in overall homelessness in the nation and 36th for childhood homelessness in the nation. We're just under 23,800 children in Nevada experiencing homelessness. And you can see on the bottom there, Nevada is the highest ranking state in the county for unsheltered, unaccompanied youth, according to the annual report by the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Next slide. So look at poverty in Nevada.
Sorry, ladies, I'm not sure what happened, why it's not showing up.
1 out of 5 children in Nevada are living in poverty. 1 out of 4 children in Nevada are considered food insecure, and 1 out of 3 children in Nevada are living with parents who lack secure employment. So just to give you an idea, the average cost of a home in Nevada is $415,000, with the average household income estimated at $56,000. Next slide. Oh, there you go.
Sorry, I see what happened. It was progressive. Let me go ahead and pop everything up for you guys. My apologies.
You're fine.
All right, ready to go to the next one?
Yes, please.
My apologies. There we go.
You're fine. So in 2017, Nevada was ranked first out of all 50 states for the greatest shortage of affordable housing for extremely low-income households. So for every 100 homes that are needed for rental availability, there are only 15 available statewide. These numbers that we've pulled from the Nevada Housing Profile show that in Nevada, the fair market rent for a 2-bedroom apartment is $966. If you look at Washoe County, it would actually be extremely difficult to find a 2-bedroom rental here under $1,100 or $1,200. And so for a family to rent that without spending more than 30% of their income on housing, they must earn at least $3,200 a month or $1,860 an hour. Due to the increase in unaffordable housing in our area, there's also an increase in families and children living in transitional situations, especially doubled up. Next slide, please. So we are Washoe County School District in Reno, Nevada. We have over 65,000 students, over 8,300 teachers and employees, and we serve 104 schools. Our school district mission is every child by name and face to graduation. Last year, we reached an all-time graduation rate of 84% for Washoe County School District, and we actually have a 90 by 20 goal instead of a 90 by 30. Next slide. So just a breakdown of how our department works. In the Office of Student Services, there's the Intervention Department, and then 4 programs under the Intervention Department, including Children in Transition, but Truancy, Reengagement, and Family Resource Centers as well. So since our program is in the same department as Truancy and our department lead runs the Student Attendance Review Board for our county, I sit on the weekly attendance review boards, and Tori sits in my place if I'm unable to attend. And this way we can assess chronically absent students that schools have been unsuccessful in re-engaging. Next slide, please. So these are our numbers of children in transition students for Washoe County. I want to note that there was not a decrease last year in the number of students identified. Between the year 2017 and 2018 school year, foster students were removed from McKinney-Vento as social services and foster families were considered to need to be providing the basic needs for those students. I still do have a foster liaison and oversee the foster part with Washoe County Human Services, but with the foster students added in last year, we were actually over 3,600 students, so the numbers are increasing. And so far this year, at the beginning of February, we've already identified 2,300 students in transition and over 500 foster students. So we're already at a total of 2,800 in February. Next slide, please.
Okay, so this is a look at students experiencing homelessness by grade level. We have the largest number of students identified in the pre-K through 6th grade levels. And then you can see a fairly dramatic drop in the numbers for the middle and high school grade levels. We suspect the reason there's fewer students identified in that age group could be from the stigma attached to the word homeless. They might be less likely to share information or ask for help. And again, just adding on to what Brittany said, you'll notice a decrease in numbers, but that is also due to the foster being taken out of McKinney-Vento there. Next slide. And then I'm going to quickly cover eligibility for students identified in our Children in Transition program. First, families that are doubled up, so sharing the housing of others due to the loss of housing or economic hardship or similar reason. Families living in motels, hotels, trailer parks, camping grounds due to lack of adequate alternative accommodations. Families living in emergency or transitional shelters. Here in Reno, we have one family shelter that houses 26 families at a time. That's also including a maternity section for mothers and children up to age 3. We have one men's shelter for 18 and older, one women's shelter for 18 and over. We have one overnight emergency shelter that will house women and children, boys only up to age 7. And then we have 2 domestic violence shelters. And then families living in a public or private place not designed for humans to live. Unaccompanied minor not living in the physical custody of a parent or legal guardian and living in one of the conditions above. And migratory children living in one of the conditions above. Next slide. So with such a large district, we have designed a system within the schools to help identifying and supporting students experiencing homelessness. In each school, we have an appointed advocate to assist with identifying students who might be experiencing homelessness. They do this by filling out a children in transition application. Then the school advocate will send it to our office here and to the local homeless liaison. The local homeless liaison will review the application to determine eligibility. And then we keep a continued partnership with the school site advocate to make sure we're removing barriers and providing resources to students who are eligible for McKinney-Vento services. Next slide. Some of the barriers that students experiencing homelessness are around enrollment, transiency, and lack of transportation. So students eligible for our Children in Transition program have the right to immediate enrollment. They have the right to enroll and attend classes immediately without any required documents, so birth certificates, immunizations, proof of residency. And then their school of origin, they have the right to remain at their school of origin when determined it's in their best interest. We know that keeping students in their school of origin is crucial so that learning is not disrupted. We want to keep students at their school of origin where they may have relationship with peers and school personnel. And we also know that keeping students at their school of origin increases the likeliness of graduation. They also have the right to transportation to their school of origin. Washoe County School District provided just under 1,000 school district bus routes back to the school of origin and 231 city bus passes last school year. And then they also have the right to enroll in any public school that housed peers living where the student is living are eligible to attend. So there's zone school as well. Next slide. And then here's some of the items that our program is able to provide for students experiencing homelessness. Once the application is filled out, a copy of that application is given directly to the kitchen manager so that they can receive free breakfast and lunch at school. We can provide school clothing and hygiene packets, uniforms, transportation when it's in their best interest, school or sports fees. We help with birth certificates, shot records, school supplies. We can help with field trip cost support, tutors, and caps and gowns for students graduating. Next slide. So now we're going to focus back in on chronic absenteeism. As mentioned earlier, chronic absenteeism describes students who miss 10% more of days enrolled. So within Washoe County School District, that averages to 2 days a month. And that, again, is for both excused and unexcused absences. And in Washoe County, we just recently changed the attendance policy. Effective this school year, all absences are considered unexcused until makeup work is complete. And that includes any medical absences and absences as a result of a student's homeless situation. And we see chronic absenteeism as a common warning signal of homelessness. Next slide. This graph illustrates the prevalence of chronic absenteeism across student groups. So you'll see 42% of students who experienced homelessness last year missed 10% or more days enrolled compared to the 10% of students who are enrolled in the Gifted and Talented program. Next slide. This graph shows the relationship between number of years chronically absent in kindergarten through grade 2 and the percent proficient on the SBAC tests in math and English. It then compares students who experienced homelessness at least one of those years and students who never experienced homelessness. So this graph is looking at two things: the number of years chronically absent and homeless versus non-homeless. So you can see there is a significant decrease in scores between house students who are chronically absent and homeless students who are chronically absent. Next slide. This graph shows the relationship between the number of years chronically absent in high school to graduation status, then shows the impact of chronic absence and homelessness on the likelihood of graduation. So you can see on this graph, the more years a student spends chronically absent, the less likely they are to graduate. And homeless students who spend years chronically absent are less likely to graduate than their housed peers. Next slide. So now looking at how we can apply all of the data surrounding absenteeism to identify and support students experiencing homelessness, we're working towards implementing a procedure within our schools to monitor attendance in a more purposeful way. Our goal is to increase the capacity among school advocates to monitor attendance among all students. So we want them to find the why regarding a student who is not attending regularly, and it may uncover that a student might be experiencing homelessness. So this is a snapshot of an administrator's dashboard, and Brittany will talk about that in a later slide in more detail. Next slide. So next, we would have a school-appointed staff member pull a school-wide report and drill down to the students at risk of or currently chronically absent, so that then they can filter the names out to send them out to the student's appointed counselor. Next slide. And then counselors can pull up the student's individualized panel and reach out to the families to see if they are experiencing any changes occurring in the home and assess unmet needs. The counselors can determine the needs and explore available resources to refer families, including identifying students as homeless when eligible. And then if a student meets the eligibility requirement, a CIT questionnaire is completed and sent to the local homeless liaison. And then at that point, the homeless local liaison can work towards addressing any attendance barriers that might be causing homelessness. And then a look at our CIT student cohort graduation rates in Washoe County. So you can see in the class of 2015, we're at 53% graduation rate and jumped up to 60% as the class of 2018. So we're hoping by continuing to apply these attendance data identification methods, we'll be able to increase CIT cohort graduation rates. Next slide.
Okay, so how do we collect and analyze this vast amount of data through Washoe County School District? So our Department of Accountability has a data warehouse that they have used for a few years to pull numbers from all of our different programs, which include Infinite Campus, to condense and make it easy for administrators and school staff to use on a daily basis through the Business Intelligence Gateway, or BIG. Next slide. So the data warehouse structure, there's a flow of reports that come down from administrators to schools and school staff to classroom teachers to students and parents. There's over 60 reports available regarding attendance, student accounting, academics, behaviors, assessments, and even extracurricular activities. Different permissions are given to access various reports and programs. So depending on an administrative counselor, teacher, student, or parent level, as Tori discussed before, the school site administrators and the area superintendents can easily pull and see readable real-time data for their schools on any given day. Next slide. So this is kind of a condensed version of our early warning system. It's an example of how we use the info in the data warehouse to help school personnel assess warning signs of any student that is not on track to graduate or move to the next grade in their younger years, or be at risk of dropping out of school. So a large component of our early warning system is chronic absenteeism and how many school years a student has been chronically absent. Next slide. So this is a condensed version of a school dashboard, but this is like a splash screen that an administrator could see when they get into school and log in. And so this is a concise way for an administrator on a daily basis to identify absenteeism issues, daily changes in attendance, new enrollments from the previous day. Next slide. And here's a close-up of some specific parts of that dashboard. So here you can see the demographics of a school, the behaviors that are happening in that school, and an administrator could click on any of these things and drill down to the classes and the students individually and what's going on. Next slide. And this is the attendance portion of that dashboard that we saw a couple of slides ago. So an administrator could get in and see that their average daily attendance of the specific school is 88%. They can look at each grade and see which grades are attending more than others. And then they could also drill down into each of these numbers on the consecutive days absent and see which students have been out for a chronic amount of time, and then be able to talk to that student's counselor or their teachers and be able to address the student individually. Next slide. So within Infinite Campus, we actually have 3 tabs that are dedicated to children in transition specifically. So one of the ways we're able to track transportation, their student info, their basic needs info, each student has 3 CIT tabs in their Infinite Campus. If they are not CIT, those tabs are just blank. But if they are, then this helps us track the overall numbers, the items and basic needs that we've provided in transportation. This also assists us during the Student Attendance Review Board process to identify if a student is already CIT or if they need to be identified as CIT, and how we can support removing barriers to them attending school. Next slide. And I know Rachel talked about this before, but staying at one high school does make a difference. So for our 2017 cohort, our overall graduation rate was 84%. Our CIT graduation rate was 53%. But those enrolled in the same high school all years that they attended high school was at 65% compared to the CIT students who attended 2 or more high schools. They only graduated at a rate of 35%. And last slide. So what does Washoe County School District do with all of the data? Aside from informing programs, tracking progress, and assisting in daily flow within the district, the numbers are used in data summits to identify strengths and weaknesses within the district to ensure the district changes and evolves as needed with student needs to make sure that we can get every child by name and face to graduation.
Thank you so much, Tori and Brittany, and I think Jen and Rachel, and we're going to speak to conclusions and policy implications. And Tori and Brittany, please feel free to chime in as needed. And real quick to intervene. Right now, I'm not seeing any questions in the questions pane. Please feel free to chime in, folks, and we definitely welcome your questions. I'll also have a couple of questions for our panelists too. But go ahead, Jen and Rachel.
This is Rachel again. Instability factors, including chronic absenteeism, have a large impact on graduation rates and are more prevalent among homeless students, which reduces the overall graduation rate among homeless students. Homeless students who stayed in shelter at some point during high school were more likely to experience chronic absenteeism and mid-year transfers, and therefore less likely to graduate than students in other temporary arrangements. Policy recommendations should be tailored to local policies and experiences. So in the case of New York City's extensive shelter system, work can be done to ensure that students are placed in shelters as close as possible to their schools and are given adequate transportation assistance and academic supports, which really are policies that should be implemented regardless of location and type of temporary housing. And knowing the prevalence of instability factors among homeless students has such a large impact on graduation rates, more than just housing status. And that shows that with proper connection to services, high school students experiencing homelessness can graduate at the same rate as their housed peers.
And so building off this last point that Rachel made, the only way we're going to know about those instability factors in time to do something about them is if we use some of the same approaches that Brittany and Dora were talking about in terms of tracking real-time data. And so this is something that Washoe County has done an amazing job of doing, but there are a number of other opportunities that exist if this is something that you're interested in doing in your own district. Attendance Works has a number of different spreadsheets that administrators and teachers can use to look at attendance and track attendance of students in a real-time way, so that you can look at not only when a student is, chronically absent after 6 months, but you can see those early patterns and think about multiple points of how much of this period of the school year has a child been absent. So really being able to access that information and then making use of it is incredibly important in terms of turning around some of these negative outcomes that we see in terms of chronic absenteeism and its impact on graduation. Another really important thing to consider is where your state stands in terms of, or your school district stands in terms of truancy, a truancy approach to attendance versus a preventative approach to attendance. And this is just sort of an example. I moved from New York State, which really had more adopted a preventative approach to attendance, to Michigan, which is still, it's in a transition right now, but truancy is still much more of a prevalent concept. And the thing about a truancy approach is that it is more reactive. And it's also more court-based. So it makes it harder often to engage families early on. So thinking about where your state stands in terms of its approach to attendance and trying to, I guess, understand how that is going to impact interventions that you might implement. And then also, to whatever degree possible, to move your school district or your state towards a more preventative approach, because preventative approaches to attendance or school absences are really what have been shown to have the greatest impact in terms of improving educational outcomes for kids. And then the last policy implication that I wanted to leave with is really just reinforcing the importance of disaggregating the data in the ways that have been so elegantly shown by other co-presenters, that without helping people to see how the difference between homeless students and housed students, or low-income students and homeless students, it's really hard to bring home the point of why it's critical to be tailoring our interventions, and why just the overall student aggregate data is not enough to change what we're seeing in terms of some of these negative graduation outcomes. And one thing that I've found in my work in Michigan, and also when I was working in New York, was really helpful in terms of helping making people understand this, was to be able to see that homeless students and meeting the needs of homeless students really was not just important to homeless students, but also important to the educational community as a whole. And being able to show those difference and the impact that, was taking place for students really helped in that way. So disaggregating the data is really another key piece here. Katie, I think that's all of the policy implications that we had for now.
Great. Jen and Rachel, thank you so much. And Brittany and Tori, I wanted to give you an opportunity because I know I had spoken with you about this previously. Could you speak a little bit more to how you approach, truancy versus prevention in Washoe County, and also relatedly a little bit more about support that you provide for children in transition regarding the completion of makeup work, so that their absences are excused and they aren't counted as truant?
Sure. So with Washoe County School District, truancy and absenteeism kind of go hand in hand. So A student can be chronically truant as well and still be referred to the Student Attendance Review Boards. So if they're late every day, they're still missing a significant chunk of school, and that needs to be addressed, and interventions need to be made to ensure that they're getting the correct amount of instruction time or doing the makeup work. And as far as our homeless students completing makeup work, since each absence is only excused when makeup work is completed, we do have tutors. So we've expanded our program to have CIT tutors at some of the Boys and Girls Club sites here in Reno, and those tutors work with the CIT students specifically to complete makeup work if they've missed school, or to help them catch up in classes that they might be falling behind in. And so far that tutoring program seems to be going really well, but it's still very new, so we're just collecting data on that now to see how much of an impact that may have.
Great, thank you so much. It was really helpful. And another question that I had for both Tori and Brittany, we had chatted about this as a group previously as well. I'd love to hear about how you empowered district buy-in, how you convinced leadership of the significance of gathering and disaggregating and leveraging chronic absenteeism data, excuse me, for children in transition and its usefulness.
So that's the great component of our program being under the intervention department and us working with the Student Attendance Review Boards. But our department lead, Rochelle Murillo, she really works on the chronic absenteeism front, and so she's a leader in the school district and helps get other people on board. But as far as getting the buy-in from the district is in Nevada, you know, we need students in their seats to get pupil funding, and for the size of our district, we actually have some of the lowest per pupil funding in the country. And so getting students in their seats is something that is very important to our district as a whole. So we've got buy-in on addressing chronic absenteeism from the superintendent down.
Thank you so much. Let's go ahead and open it up to questions. As I noted before, here I said to put it in the chat box, but if you could go ahead and put it in the questions pane, that would be great. And it looks like we've got a couple questions so far. Our first, and again, to our panelists, feel free to chime in if you feel that you can answer the question posed by the participant. This person asks, are McKinney-Vento / homeless student liaisons in school districts required to look at and analyze homeless student data in relation to chronic absenteeism data, or would this be up to community partners to compile this type of data to use for advocacy purposes?
I guess this is Jennifer. I can answer that for the state of Michigan. There is no requirement here for that data to be looked at. In fact, it's only recently been available. It is now required for the state to track that data, but often it's very hard for the McKinney-Vento liaisons to access the data. So, you know, one of the first steps that is really needed often is just bridging that gap and figuring out how the information that exists on chronic absenteeism, graduation rates for homeless students, how that can actually get to McKinney-Vento liaisons who are working on the ground with schools so that they have the information they need to really make the case to those school districts and to other key players in the community about why this is an important issue.
Thanks, Jen. Did anybody else want to chime in? Okay. A second question, does the HUD definition of homelessness vary by state level at all? My response is, I believe no. Again, folks, feel free to chime in, but I believe that's a federal definition, and that based on the HUD definition, children and youth and families and individual adults you know, have their access to different shelters and shelter systems, you know, depends on that definition. Does anybody else want to speak to that? All right. Next question. How is the Children in Transition work funded?
So we are funded through the McKinney-Vento grant and then also through Title I-A. And then here in Washoe County School District, we do receive a lot of gifts and donations as well from different entities and from individuals.
Thank you. Another question, and apologies if I'm misinterpreting this incorrectly, if I'm interpreting this incorrectly, is tardy included in absences? Are tardies included in absences? If students have excessive tardiness, is that counted as absent?
This is Jennifer. This is possible that it varies by state. What I can say for Michigan is that if you miss half a day or more of school, then it's counted towards chronic absenteeism. You have to actually be in your seat for at least half the school day. And that's a change in the last year. So I think some of these definitions are evolving and might vary a little bit by state in terms of how they're counting that. I don't know if anyone else has comments on that.
So in Washoe County School District, that's where the truancy comes in. So if somebody is continually tardy, our department looks at their truancies and they can be served with truancy letters from their schools and then still be put through the student attendance review boards because they are missing school. And if they are older, they could be cited through juvenile services after so many truancy letters or tardies if they're not showing up to school on time.
Thank you so much, ladies. Another question, are you engaging any community-based organizations in the work at the school district?
So this is Brittany. In Washoe County, we do have a lot of local agencies that we work with. So I do work with Washoe County Human Services on a daily basis for our foster students, but we also have funding from the Rotary Club here in Reno to work with our tutoring program. And we have a lot of support and funding from other agencies like the Assistance League, and just we also do trainings with our advocates, since we have an advocate in each school. So the homeless liaisons do trainings and they work with outside agencies to come to those trainings to connect resources to our school advocates, which are almost always counselors within the school.
Thank you. Another question, are the interventions provided under the trauma-informed and or building resiliency lens? What kind of pushback, if any, did you receive from schools or districts that were stuck in more punitive approaches? What were the outcomes of that?
Katie, can you repeat that? It kind of cut out a little bit.
Sure, I'm sorry. Here we go. Let me scroll back. It was a long one, but a great one. Are the interventions provided under the trauma-informed and or building resiliency lens? They go on to ask, what kind of pushback, if any, did you receive from schools or districts that were stuck in more punitive approaches, and what were the outcomes of that?
So we do, within Washoe County School District, we do have the Peace Grant, which is working with some schools in the district to become trauma-informed schools. And some of our schools have social workers on site, which we do help work with our staff for some of that trauma-informed stuff, but that is not something that we have in every school at this point. It's hopefully something that we'll be able to expand upon. But as far as my staff, we ensure that we continually go to trainings and conferences to make sure that we are addressing the trauma-informed approach.
And this is Jennifer. I know I mentioned in my slides earlier that Michigan seems to be in a transition. What I would say is I think whether or not the approaches are trauma-informed really varies a lot by the local district. And how much pushback there is also varies a lot. So you see some districts that really are taking a preventative approach to attendance that is very trauma informed, and other districts that really are operating more on, I guess the best way, truancy model, where their citations, families are going to court, being brought into court. Obviously, some are doing both, but I think it really depends on who is in charge of the attendance program and what their beliefs on that are.
Thank you so much, Jen. I'm confirming that that was our last question. I believe so. Any last thoughts before I move on to share some resources with our participants? All right. Well, here we have a couple of websites listed. As the manager for Education Leads Home, I work for Schoolhouse Connection. I've included our website here. We have just a slew of archived webinars, tools, shared guest perspectives, a very rich Q&A inbox where we answer all kinds of questions related to student homelessness. You can sign up for our newsletter. I really encourage you to check it out. If you use Facebook, we're also active on Facebook and have a really rich community that supports one another and sharing best practices and answering questions for one another. We also have a lot of resources, as I mentioned previously, on the Education Leads Home website. We collaborate often with the National Center on Homeless Education, and we shared their website here. Poverty Solutions, for which Jennifer Earp Downward works, has another great set of rich resources, as do the folks at ICPH, Washoe County Schools, where you can see all the great work that they're doing, and two other entities that do a lot of work in the chronic absenteeism and early warning systems space are Attendance Works and the Everyone Graduates Center. We'll be working with Attendance Works and the Everyone Graduates Center and a couple other groups and folks in the coming months to provide some additional webinars on chronic absenteeism. This is just the first in our series, so we really hope that you keep an eye out for additional resources and conversations and tools addressing chronic absenteeism and how we can all work to improve the educational outcomes of children and youth experiencing homelessness. We have here our contact information. Please feel free to send us an email with follow-up questions, and we always love to see what people are doing that works. So if you have some exciting best practices to share, we really, really encourage you to send them our way. Don't be surprised if that means that we contact you about writing a guest perspective, a guest blog for our website. We try to make it as easy a lift for folks as possible, but we think it's a fun and really interactive and truly helpful way to let other people know what you're doing and what's replicable. And that is all, everybody. Thank you so much for your questions. Thanks so much for our panelists for sharing all of your great work with us. I'll stay online for a couple more minutes to see if folks send any last-minute questions. Otherwise, again, please send them via email, and look to your email and to our website for a link to the recorded version of this webinar and all of the related materials, including the PowerPoint and the reports mentioned by Jen and Rachel. You can actually find those here on the handouts tab as well. You can do a direct download, but again, we'll be making them available on our website. Thanks again, everybody, and have a beautiful afternoon.